form of a parable. And Lois actually said to me, as long as it's not, you named two. Do you remember what they were? The Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son. So I did not choose those, but I will reference both of them in my sermon here today. But you had the chance to choose, and I'm sorry. As many of you know, there are big fancy names that are given when someone has a fear of something. So if you are afraid of being in enclosed areas, it is called claustrophobia. I think that's also the name for being afraid of jolly red elves that come at Christmas time. Claustrophobia. Wasn't my joke, no. So claustrophobia is the fear of enclosed areas, the fear of let me go this way. Arachnophobia is the fear of what? Spiders. And do you know what the fear of giants is called? The fear of giants is called fee-fi-phobia. Or claustrophobia, okay? So I tell that joke because today we are talking about stories, we're talking about parables, we're talking about narratives. And as I'm sitting down to write this sermon for today, I had this ongoing argument in my head. And maybe I'm the only one that does this. You're welcome to correct me if I'm wrong. But sometimes I make up arguments in my head and I argue both sides of it. And the sad thing is I often lose those arguments, which is weird. I know, it's weird, right? You think I should at least be 50-50 on that, but no. And the argument that I'm having in my head here as I'm reading this scripture and preparing for today is, I imagine I'm having a conversation with an angry atheist. And I've never come up against an angry atheist, but you see them sometimes online. They're these people that come to you and they want to demand an answer. They ask you these questions. They think they're going to stump you. So in my mind, I've come up against, agnostic people with questions. That's all cool. I get that. But I've never had this experience. But in my mind, this angry atheist comes up to me and he says, "Pastor, I got a question for you." And they always call me pastor in my head. I don't know why that's the case, but they do. So, "Pastor, I got a question for you. Do you know that there are stories in the Bible that are made up?" So a person comes up to me and says, "Pastor, do you know that there are stories in the Bible that are made up?" Well, what would you do if someone came up to you and said that? Well, in my head, I would say, I know. And there's some of my favorite stories. Let me tell you this story that Jesus told. It was this story about a person who was traveling to from Jerusalem to Jericho. And these two guys, they jumped him and they beat him and they robbed him and they left him on the side of the road. And as they were walking by, two different clergymen, people of his religion, they crossed to the other side of the road to avoid that guy. But then somebody came along. And somebody helped him out, and they took him and they paid for his care and for his food, and they made sure that he was cared for the time being. And that person was a Samaritan. Jesus tells this story whenever a person approaches him and asks the question, "Who is my neighbor?" And then later in that same book of the Bible, there's another story that is completely made up. There's a story that Jesus tells about this son who goes to his father, and he asks him for his inheritance. And this guy's still alive. That's a huge insult. Now, give me my money now. I want my property. That's a huge insult, but yet the father does it. And the guy goes out, and what do you think he does? He blows that money on, bubblegum and records and comes back. Bubblegum. So he comes back. He's all upset because he knows that he's disgraced his father. He's blown his inheritance. He's asking his dad, "Can I just be a servant? Can I work for you?" And his father receives him with open arms, hugs him, and welcomes him back to the family. And that story didn't happen either. And those are two of my favorite made-up stories in the Bible. So if somebody comes to me and says, "There are stories in the Bible that are made up," I would say, absolutely, those are some of my favorite. And we have a word for those stories, those made-up stories. We call them parables. Jesus uses them to teach people some very deep concepts. Now, I do actually believe that most of the Bible is real. I believe that Jesus really did come to the earth. He lived a perfect life, and I really do believe he died and rose again. I'm not saying all of the Bible is made up, but there are absolutely these stories in there that didn't happen. And some people might say that these stories simply aren't true. I'm not quite willing to use that language. I don't want to say that the parables aren't true, because I believe that they tell a story truer than anything else, even truer than the truth that you and I think we know. So what we're going to do today is we're going to continue with our series on the creative and the explorative side of Christianity. So often we have focused within our tradition on the prescriptive and the rescriptive, what we have to do and what we don't do, what we can do, what we're not supposed to do. The rules, the regulations, the creeds, the laws, and these things do have their place. But have we focused too much on the prescriptive and restrictive without looking at the creative and the explorative? Because I believe that we can find more meaning, deeper meaning through the creative and the explorative. Let me give you a quick example. In 1 John chapter 4, there's this statement about God. It's very simple. You've heard it before. It's 3 words. It says, God is love. Okay, Will, you knew that one. You responded. Now I'm calling you out. Can you tell me, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more. No, okay, and I'm going to make it more difficult. And it's not just you, anybody. Tell me, what is love, but use rules and regulations, the prescriptive and descriptive. Can you tell me what's the rule about love? Like, that's not how you do it, is it? No, like I can come up with some rules about love. I might say that I tell my kids, I make rules that you cannot play in the street because I love them. But that rule itself isn't love. It's something I do out of love. And we can look at chapters like 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, the love chapter. It talks about love is this and love is that. And that's giving attributes of love, but yet it's not giving rules about love. We can talk about what love does, what love results in by giving rules and regulations. But if you want to know what love is, you don't turn to rule books. You turn to the poets. You turn to the song lyricists. You turn to those who are creative and develop these things. If you want to know what love is, you turn to Hathaway and his hits from the 1990s. Baby, don't hurt me no more. So today, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you the power of narrative. Oh, I had in my notes, we turned to Taylor Swift. That would have been funny. If you really want to know what love is, you turn to Taylor Swift. A little pre-Super Bowl. So today, no, I'm sorry. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 different areas that I think we can grow in by looking at these parables, at stories, at narrative. And I'm going to use these words interchangeably. Sometimes, there's different nuances. What is a parable? What is a story? What is a fable? I'm going to just use those words interchangeably today, so if it's a little confusing, I apologize. And here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to see how parables can expand your circle. We're going to see how parables can open the door to self-reflection. We'll see how parables help us understand others. And we're going to see how parables help us comprehend abstract concepts and principles. So let's go ahead and start with the first one there. We're going to see how parables help us to expand our circle. And we're going to do so by bringing in C.S. Lewis. Boom, head came up. C.S. Lewis is probably best known, he wrote many books, many articles, but probably best known for his creative fiction work, The Chronicles of Narnia. And probably many of you have heard of The Chronicles of Narnia. Maybe you've seen the movies, you've read the books. And here's just a few images from the movies. In The Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis tells the story of these 4 children in England. They're living in London during World War II, but they need to relocate because there is danger, there's bombing in London. So they go out to live in the countryside. While they're there, they find a magical wardrobe, a closet that they can walk through and enter into this fictional world, this fantastic world known as Narnia. And in Narnia, these 4 children realize that there's this ongoing battle between good and evil. The problem is, you can't always tell which is which. There's this, well, speaking of which, there is a witch there, W-I-T-C-H, the white, is it white witch? Yeah, the white witch is where? The white witch is in Narnia. Easy for you to say. The white witch is there, and she appears by all like outside appearances to be a good person. She even offers the kids food. Like anybody that offers me snacks, I assume must be a good person. So here's the white witch. She's talking to these children, but yet on the other side of the whole argument, there is Aslan, the lion. You see him right over here. And the kids soon realize that the white witch is trying to mislead them. Aslan is really the real good one. He's the one that they should be following. And most of the kids, they go and they align themselves with Aslan, except for Edmund. And Edmund seems to be duped by the white witch. And he kind of gives away some secrets. And he kind of follows her a little bit. And he's eating his Turkish delight and enjoying the treats that she has to offer. And he makes a deal with the witch that he can't go back on. Well, Aslan hears about this deal that Edmund has made, and he can't go back on. And what does Aslan do? He offers to give himself up in Edmund's place. He offers his life in turn for Edmund to be released. And Aslan is killed by the White Witch and her followers. Ready for the spoiler alert? Aslan doesn't stay dead. He comes roaring back to life and defeats the evil White Witch. He played a trick on this source of evil and pulled the wool over her eyes, tricked her into releasing Edmund, and he came back to life. Does that sound familiar at all? What's that sound like? That kind of sounds like Jesus. Like C.S. Lewis was just like copying off of somebody else, right? Very creative man, but I think that story's been told. No, it's a thinly veiled story about the death and resurrection of Jesus, who died so that we could be purchased back, or to be redeemed, or to trick the evil one so that we could have our freedom. How many people do you think have read these books or seen that video or the movie? Probably thousands, millions of people around the world have read this story. And I realize that many people have read this story. They've been exposed to the story about Jesus and his resurrection in this thinly veiled way. Thousands, millions of people have read these stories, that these people would never set foot in a church or pick up their Bible. But I believe that God can still work through these stories. So I believe that parables, stories, narrative, this creative aspect helps us to widen our circle. Next one, self-reflection. This is where we will engage that story a little bit, the parable that Lois read for us. Now, I've quoted these numbers before, and in the Bible, Jesus asks 307 different questions. I think Jesus was a smart guy, right? Like, it says in John that Jesus is the creator of heaven and earth. All things were created through him. Like, what kind of questions would he have for us? Obviously, Jesus is not simply asking questions because he doesn't know the answers. He's trying to stimulate our thought processes, make us think a little bit deeper. Jesus asked 307 questions. He asks 183 questions of people. I think it would be extremely frustrating to come up to Jesus and ask a question, because what does he usually do? He asks a question back to you. So out of the 183 times the Bible talks about Jesus being asked a question, how many times does he actually give a straightforward answer? 3. 3 times he gives, like, just tell me what you want. Like, just tell me the right answer, Jesus. But no, he's always, that reminds me of a story. And I'm not sure about today's passage. This could be considered one of the 3 times he actually gives an answer. But it's not a straightforward answer either. So Peter is feeling really good about himself. Like, he's given a little pat on his back. He's thinking that he's being very generous and gracious. And Peter comes up to Jesus. He says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Like, I love he gives a number. 7 times, because that's pretty generous. Look at me, I'm Peter, I'm forgiving people. And Jesus does give an answer, but it's not quite as straightforward as we would want it to be. He says either 77 times or 70 times 7. It's not entirely clear in the New Testament which one he says. Either way, what he's saying is 7 times is way too low. So he launches into this story, this parable about this guy who was a ruler, he was a king, and he sought out people who had debts with him. And he came across this one guy, and it says in the text today that the first guy that he finds owed the king 10,000 bags of gold, or the original language says talents. And a talent is the equivalent of 20 years of labor. If you're quick at math, that's a lot of years of labor. That's 200,000 years of labor. You have to live a long time to be able to repay back that debt. So take whatever you make in a year, multiply it times $200,000. That's how much this guy owed. And whenever he can't pay, whenever he starts complaining, like, I simply can't, I'm not going to, like, who could come up with millions of dollars right on the spot? What does the master do? The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. Then immediately after this takes place, the master, or the servant's master, the servant that was just forgiven, goes out and he sees somebody that owes him some money. And it says that the other person owed him 100 silver coins, or denarii. A denarius is equivalent of a day's wage. So he owes him, it's not insignificant. He owes him about 100 days, or a third of a year of his wages. But the guy who had just been forgiven requires the other guy to pay back every penny. And when he can't, he throws him into debtor's prison until he can pay the bill. And it's at that point that the master, the ruler, sees this going on and says, what's going on? You were just forgiven millions of dollars, and you're not going to forgive this guy for his thousands? And he throws him in prison and makes him pay for it. And I think the point of this whole story, I paraphrase it like this. The master says, you've been forgiven millions. Why don't you forgive his thousands? And I believe that stories like this cause us to reflect a little bit on our own lives and our own practices. And if I just came up to one of you and pointed out something in your life, I'm not going to make any eye contact right now. If I tried to point out something that I thought you were doing wrong or abusing something or someone, what do you immediately do? You probably put up your defenses. You backpedal a little bit. You say, I know you are, but what am I? I'm rubber, you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me, sticks to you. Theological arguments. But whenever you tell a story like this, it makes you think. And this is what I realized. The question that I have for myself and others is, why do those who have experienced grace tend to be the least likely to extend grace to others? If I just went up to you and said you need to extend grace to other people, you're going to get defensive. But if we enter in this story, it allows us to reflect on our own lives. Next area that stories, parables help us is to understand others' perspectives. And I really like this story, even though it's everything seems to be negative, right? There's a number of negative parables. We'll get to a couple positive ones here shortly. But I also would point out it's not just Jesus who tells parables in the Bible. The one that I'm thinking of here comes from 2 Samuel, beginning in, I think, chapter 11. And it's the story of David and Bathsheba. David sees Bathsheba. She's lovely. She's bathing. It's in the Bible. She's naked, and David sees it. And he thinks, that's going to be my wife. Problem is, she's already married to somebody else. So what does David do? He has her husband sent off into war, puts him at the front of the lines, and has him killed. The power the king has is really unfathomable to me. So David now has Bathsheba for his own wife, and the prophet Nathan comes to David, and he tells him a little story. He says, there once was this guy who had a single sheep, and he loved this sheep. He cared for the sheep like it was one of his own children. The sheep slept in his bed. He fed it from his own table, treated it like it was his own offspring. But there was another man, and this man had many, many sheep and livestock and animals and land and farm equipment and tractors and Corvettes and fast cars. This man was doing really well for himself, and he had a friend come and visit. And instead of killing one of his own lambs to feed this guy, he went and stole that other guy's lamb and slaughtered it for his friend to eat. And then David gives the appropriate response. I see some of the responses in the back. The eyebrows are up. And David says this: David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." The prophet Nathan looks him right in the eyes, and help me out if you know the line. What does he say? "You are the man." And it's not like an early 2000s compliment, like, "You the man." No, that's about you. Usually when we hear stories, what do? We enter in on the side of the oppressed, the side of the person who's been hurt, and we try to sympathize with that person. And in this story, Nathan tells the story one more time. Nathan in Samuel tells this story, and David enters into the position of the oppressed person, feeling for that person, and understands from the other's perspective. Parables help us understand others. And let's do one more, the last area. Parables help us comprehend abstract concepts. I started this morning with that example of love. Describe love for me. Define love for me. Well, I can't really tell you what love is, but I can tell you what love looks like. I can tell you stories about love. I can tell you poems or songs. We could talk about Taylor Swift songs all day long. Sorry, I need to move on. Give me another artist. What's love got to do with it? But a second hand in motion or something like that? I don't know. That's a metaphor that I don't quite get. Anyway. But what about examples like grace, forgiveness? Things, again, like describe for me, what is grace like? And one of the things that Jesus does, this is one of the good, positive parables, is we find in Luke chapter 15 3 separate parables. Each one telling a different story, but yet getting to the same truth. The first one involves a shepherd who has 100 sheep. And one of those sheep wanders off, and the shepherd leaves all the 99 behind to go find that sheep. The very next story he tells is about a woman who had 10 coins. She lost one of her coins, and she then turns her house upside down, cleaning, sweeping, looking under the sofa, everything she has, until she finds that lost coin. And then the third and final parable in that section is the story of a lost son, the parable of the prodigal son that I alluded to earlier. The son leaves looking to expand his wealth and his riches and spend it on things that probably shouldn't have, only to return to the father who accepts him with open arms. Now we have these 3 different stories, and one may ask the question, why does Luke think we need to have the same story 3 times over in different parables? Well, my friend Claire Good, who was the pastor at Waynesboro Mennonite until recently, he came from a missionary background. He served among the Maasai in Africa. And he talks about how the Maasai used to stack stories. You have one story, then you tell another story and another story, and each story adds a different component about the point you're trying to make. And I think that's what Luke is doing when he tells these 3 parables, one after the other after the other. He's stacking these stories to explain a difficult concept. Because when I hear the story of the lost sheep, if I just have that one, I'm like, well, I'm one of the 99. I didn't stray. Does that mean God leaves me behind while he's off searching for other people? Well, no. God is also like the father in the prodigal son who stays home with the older son. Okay, all right, well, so God just sits back and relaxes as I'm out there, losing my wealth and my goods and all the things that I've been given and blowing my life. No, God is also like the woman who turns her house upside down looking for the lost coin. So I think these 3 stories, these 3 parables, give a stacked understanding of God's grace. God is like a shepherd who searches for the lost sheep. God is like a woman who turns his house or her house upside down, searching for a coin. God is like a father who runs to meet you when you turn back to him. So then we have the question, what does all this mean for us today? And the first thing I would say is that the teachings of the parables are timeless. Like, tell me the prodigal son doesn't still translate into today's world. Like, do we still need grace? Oh yeah. Do we still need to forgive one another and be forgiven? Yeah. Is the parable of the Good Samaritan, does that translate today? Yeah. Love your neighbor? Yeah, even if they're Samaritans, outsiders? Yeah, I think we need that message. Teachings of the parables are timeless. They maybe need to be adapted a little bit because we don't know what a talent or a denarii is, but a little bit of translation, these things still apply today. The other thing I would say is we can write modern parables to speak to the concerns of our world as well. So this week I was doing a little bit of, we call it creative exploring, which means playing around on the internet while I'm writing a sermon. And I was checking bulletins from other churches in our district just to see how things were going. And I saw a pastor in one of our local churches was preaching on a topic, and he titled his sermon, "The Parable of the Barking Dog." Now, I've read the Bible. I've read especially the New Testament a few times through, right? Maybe you have as well. Do you remember the parable of the barking dog? No, he was writing a new parable for today. And that sermon hadn't posted yet when I was writing this, so I didn't have a chance to explore what he was getting to, but I think I'm going to check that out. So I wonder, what would a modern parable look like for us today? And I thought a little bit about our situation, and I think one might be something like this. The kingdom of God is like a guy on social media. And this guy on social media and his friend start having disagreements. And this friend starts posting all of these political posts that drive this man crazy. He starts to wonder, if he and this guy can continue to be friends. He becomes defensive because he says those posts, they don't represent what he actually believes or how he acts or how he lives his life. He believes that he's being misrepresented by this friend's posts online. Other people jump in and they start arguing back and forth with this guy as he posts these political posts. But what does the first guy do? He decides to take a break from social media and invite that guy to lunch and thus enjoy their friendship and encouraging that to go on and on. The kingdom of God is like face-to-face conversation. What could these modern parables look like today? I think that we are called, like Jesus, to be explorative and creative. We were made in the image of God, and God in Jesus Christ told stories, made up stories that weren't just not true, they were in fact truer than true can be. Let's pray. God, thank you for